So good morning and welcome to what is at least our third annual assessment day here at the College of St. Rose. As you know, assessment is an important part of our jobs, our responsibilities as we think back over what we've done in the past year and make plans for the upcoming year. And so we've designed this day to provide, some information and training about college's assessment efforts, and also some tips and hints for completing your annual assessment reports, which, as a reminder, will be due on June 15th. So we have three things planned for this morning, three formal things planned for this morning. First, we will have an overview of our previous assessment report, our annual assessment report. Just as a reminder, once you submit your either program or unit assessment, your SLOA or your SOAR, those are reviewed by the assessment committee, the IAWG, as we are known, and I'm going to introduce those members in a minute. Following that review, IAWG completes a summary report, which then goes to the president and is released to the campus. We also look at those findings, align the recommendations with the strategic plan, and then monitor those recommendations to make sure that we're on track for doing the things that we've identified that we want to do moving forward, and also recognize the things that we've accomplished in previous years. And then that will be followed by Dr. Jerry Lawrence, who will provide an overview of assessment and middle states and summarize some of the recommendations related to assessment that we included in our self-report. And then finally, we'll do breakout groups by SOAR or SLOA to provide you with a brief overview of how to complete the process and allow those who are completing a particular report to ask questions or share ideas or helpful hints with others who might be new to the process. So I think before we move into the overview of the annual assessment report, I'd like to introduce or identify and thank the members of the IAWG, and they include Ian McDonald, Jerry Lawrence, Lita Carbone, Matt Woods, Val Myers, and who am I missing? Trying to see everybody who's here. Regina Screven is also a member of the IAWG. And we will be looking to have some additional members in the upcoming year. So thank you. And at this time, I'm going to share with Ian, or turn it over to Ian and Matt, who will provide the overview.
Thank you, Margaret. And I will share my screen. And so hopefully everyone can see this beautiful PowerPoint I put together using templates. All right. All right, so again, I'm Ian McDonald. If anyone here hasn't met me yet, it's great to be here. I'm also here with my colleague, Matthew Woods, and we thought it would be useful to provide an overview of the assessment report that the IAWG put out, sort of a summary of it. This was released, I believe, a few months back, and tries to pull together some of the themes and takeaways from all of the collected SOARs and SLOAs. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Woods. You want to talk a little about how it was created?
Sure. So how this process works is, like Margaret said, once all the SOARs and SLOAs are submitted, the IAWG basically pairs off and looks at a few bunches of each of the reports, and we look for common themes, for anything important, like how well certain goals were met, if there are certain challenges that multiple offices are facing. So we can kind of pool that together, and then as a group come up with an idea of, okay, well, how can we attack this as a campus? How can we overcome these challenges? And how can we highlight these successes? Who's involved is, like Margaret had pointed out, all the members of the IAWG. Like I said, we all kind of just pair up, and here's the full list here of everyone. We all pair up and take a bunch and individually look at them, come together as small groups to see what we all found in common. And then as the large group, we start to synthesize a full report based off of all the common themes and similar issues.
And what is the purpose?
The purpose is just basically to give an overview or a snapshot of how the college is performing at meeting each of its departmental goals, and how those departmental goals are meeting the overall goals of the strategic plan.
Thank you, Matt. So we have when we looked through all of these SOARs and SLOAs, we meet as a committee bi-weekly throughout the academic year. So when we do have a full submission and everything's turned in, we start reading and pulling together themes, patterns, takeaways, and we also look at the progress on goals from the prior year. So we're always, when we produce this report, we're always going to be talking about a year back. So last year was the 21-22 cycle. So we're comparing it to the 20-21 cycle, knowing that these were extraordinary times, of course. So we have made notes of those. So from 20-21, we saw the highest slowest submission rate at 93% over prior years, while the 21-22 SOARs declined. Submissions declined. We also created a new version of the forms for both SLOA and SOAR on SharePoint, which is a much, I guess, much more user-friendly form. And we also identified some of the exemplary SLOA and SOAR reports so that we can share some of those in training. I know for our students, they find it very helpful when we share a stellar example of an assignment. So I always like to see that when I go to submit something. I want to see what one that was well done looks like, so that I can model my response after that, because this is new for a lot of us, filling out some of these forms. And we also decided that in the next assessment cycle, when we see budgetary requests, which we did see a few of those in some of the reports, that we're going to pull those together and summarize those earlier, so that they may make the next budget cycle, right? So Matt, if you want to take the next
Sure.
slide here.
I saw there was some discussion in the chat about what each of the forms are. SLOAs are what are performed by the faculty, is the faculty-based assessment, and the SOAR forms are what is the administrative office assessment. So for 22-23, we want to identify the resources that we need to support the completion of the SLOAs and the SOARs. Like we said, like you saw in the previous slide, SOAR completion did decrease from the previous cycle. So we want to figure out what the reasoning for that is and help boost those numbers up for future cycles. We know how important communication is on this campus, so we want to work on developing stronger communication processes for the SLOA and SOAR reporting between not just like all of our findings, but also making sure that there are check-ins to see how people are doing on completing the forms, as well as how they are at achieving the goals that they had stated from the previous year, which ties into strengthening our campus-wide feedback processes. I know that was part of Middle States as well, to make sure that we have more voices on IAWG and more outreach from the community itself. Continuing offering assessment day, look, we're here. We also want to add in a check-in midway through the cycle, sometime around December, January, just to see how various offices are doing with their goals and what services we can provide as a working group to help with completion of the forms, as well as progress on goals. Improve SOAR and the SLOA forms. Everyone should thank Lita, because she was the one that put in a lot of work creating the SharePoint forms, as well as the videos that you'll see later today on how to work those forms. And provide some opportunities related to assessment, especially for folks that are new to the assessment process, to make sure that everyone is aware of how our assessment process works, how to complete the forms, what we're looking for in terms of goals or data and things like that.
Matt? Yeah, and please continue to use the chat to ask questions, and we'll open it up to questions at the end as well. And this report, again, if you're just joining us, this report has been released, and we're just summarizing what was in the content of that report. So we, again, as a institutional assessment working group, we review all of the assessment reports, and we look to see what the percentage was of the SLOA, so student learning outcomes assessment. That's on the academic side, and SOARs are on the administrative office side. Just again, so we can clarify what these are. As you can see, the number of SLOA reports on the education side has increased, and we had 58 submissions last year. And if we look at the percentage of reports with recommendations, it's been somewhat steady on the academic side, but we're seeing more and more recommendations on the administrative side. But we did notice that there was a bit of a decline in the number of submissions due to a variety of reasons, turnover, and others that we've, that we're looking into. Maybe training is needed in some of those areas.
And Ian, if you don't mind,
Sure.
some of the, as far as the SOAR reports, we had some units that have actually merged. So that also represented a decrease in number of overall reports.
Very true. So Matt, you want to take this one, and I'm
Sure.
here to help.
So when we look through this, when the IAWG looked through the SLOAs, the three big things that we found were student deficiencies in terms of motivation, preparedness, especially in the wake of COVID. Students coming in less and less prepared for college, as well as what it means to be a college student. Communication issues across campus within departments. I don't think that's a surprise to most people. And what we notice as a working group, lack of detail and specificity and goals and benchmarks. Like a lot of groups are using nationwide or other assessment goals, which we're not 100% certain as a working group how well they apply to the college. So those were some of the things that we had seen for the SLOAs. And then for the SOARs, again, the importance of outreach and communication, especially early outreach and communication, both to students and to other members of the community. As Margaret mentioned earlier, staffing issues, with offices merging or some positions taking a longer time to fill, so they weren't filled for the full assessment cycle. So that led to part of the issues with SOAR submission. A lot of challenges with formatting the SOAR report itself. The old PDF form that we had was tough to type in. For some of us, was very hard to read because the font got down to about 2-point font. And then, like I said, Lita has gone to great lengths to create a form that will be easier for us to read and easier for everyone to work with.
Thank you, Matt.
Yep.
And we also looked to see what some of the intersecting themes were between both the academic side and the administrative side of the house. And clearly what was in some of the earlier reports and still appearing in the reports from 21-22 were, you know, the effects of the pandemic. I mean, we're really in a kind of a data blip. So, you know, 10, 15, 20 years from now, we're still actually doing this and enjoying assessment. We'll probably look back on these years as kind of a bit of an anomaly, but the effects of the pandemic were still present in the reports that we saw. And also the assessment process overall was a common theme in there. And Matt, I don't know if you want to expand a little bit on that.
Well, I think part of it is, like we had said, the communication about how to complete the forms, how to best make the goals. Like I know last year we had, as part of assessment day, talking about SMART goals and things like that, as well as completion of the form and making sure the forms are turned in on time, how to create effective recommendations and things like that. And also just making sure the whole thing is much more open, and so people see that the school itself is valuing the assessment process, so we can each have more value to it.
And then we have our recommendations that we put together from the review of the 21-22. Again, we're always a year behind, right, when it comes to the report we're looking at and the recommendations. So just keep that in mind. This is what our recommendations were from about a year ago reporting. And, you know, we really want to find out what we can do to help increase the completion rates for SLOAs and SOARs. On the academic side, they were excellent last year. We'd love to see that 100%. I think middle states would like to see that to be 100% as well. So we want to inch that up. And on the SOAR side, you know, what do we need? What are the obstacles? We need to identify what those are. It's just training, if there's support. You know, we want to be able to identify what we can do to help increase that submission rate. And again, communications is a theme it's weaved throughout every slide I have up here, right? Strong communication process for the reporting, and that might involve who's following up. You know, if we're missing something, who's going to follow up with that, who's going to step in, who's going to be the backup, and that sort of things that the reports get submitted. And we also want to strengthen the feedback process from our own committee, so that we can make sure that we're getting this information out and then the feedback out better. I mean, as you know, we've had a lot of turnover at the college. So hopefully we're at a bit of a platform of stability now where we'll have a institutional assessment group intact throughout the next academic cycle and provide some of this feedback. And also we're going to continue to improve the forms. These were created when we had a director of assessment several years ago. They've gone through several revisions, and we're trying to make these as painless as possible. So we'll continue to look at those. And also the recommendation be to provide some assessment related PD for both academic side of the house and administrative. And Matt, if I'm missing anything, let me know.
No, I think that was it.
So the famous question slide. Does anyone have any questions? And I'll monitor the chat as well.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat. What percentage is 58 SLOAs? That seems like a lot. That was a number, not a percent.
In a previous slide, it was 93% of the SLOAs were submitted. Let me just find that for you.
I think it's go back one more. There it is.
Yep. So we had the highest submission rate of SLOAS.
So yes, the 58 was the actual raw number of SLOAS.
And that includes the individual SLOAs for each of the outcomes for the liberal ed core. So that accounts for, because this was 2021, 22, that accounts for 11 of the SLOA reports.
Okay, any questions? I guess you can use the chat or raise hand, or as my students do, just shout out. I guess I would also say if you have had a chance to read the report, you know, and you have any feedback, both Matt and I would be very happy to receive that feedback and share it with the IAWG. And you know, other information you want to see in the report and so on.
We also have an email, and I'm going to put it in the chat, which is assessment@strohs.edu. So throughout the year, if you have suggestions or thoughts related to our assessment processes or structure, we welcome your input.
I see Professor Wiley has raised her hand.
Yeah, so if no one else is asking this, it's a pretty generic question, but you know, if the SLOA summaries reveal that there's a student deficiencies in motivation and preparedness, I'd wonder what sort of systemic responses, college-wide responses we're taking to that, and to what extent this is connected to our budget priorities. So I would like to see, you know, some more systemic structural responses built in to help students with motivation and preparedness. So that's my question. Thank you.
Sure, I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I would say that the purpose of this report in the committee is to identify the common themes and recommendations. And I think it's up to us as a college to try to solve the problems. And I know that student deficiencies and preparedness is something that's definitely on the radar of both faculty and administration. And I think we'd all like to see some advancement towards assisting some of these students.
And I would add to that the goal is to be able to tie this in specifically with the budget process. And the sooner that we get these annual reports, the sooner we're able to put together the summary and to use this as evidence for budget requests. I think we've also tried to have representation on the IAWG across the various divisions on the campus, so that information is cycling back. You know, as far as specifics, I think, you know, the Academic Success Center is continuing to work on ways to improve their services, to add things like a summer bridge program. Currently, there's a group of folks who are working on a federal grant request to provide some funding for some additional support. You know, so I think it's very much in process. And I think it is important that we use our assessment efforts as well as these reports to help tie things together and move things forward.
Thank you. You know, you mentioned the feedback loop, and I know that I've been submitting, you know, assessment reports to Chalk and Wire for many, many years, and just, you know, would like to know that information is being used productively to address the problems. You know, we have identified the problems. I just, you know, they seem to be ongoing.
Yes. And sometimes those solutions are not as easy as we would like them to be. But that doesn't mean we should back away from them.
Well, I'm glad that it's a priority, and I definitely appreciate what Matt's office has been doing through the many, many, many changes. Thank you, Matt,
Yep, thank you, Jean.
and to your people.
I'll pass that on to them. They're both at doctor's appointments this morning.
Okay. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but I guess we'll leave the air open for another 30 seconds or so if there's another question.
So I think we've done enough wait time. So thank you very much, Matt and
Thank you.
Ian, both for
Yep.
providing this report and for taking the lead on actually putting together the draft of this year's annual assessment report. If you want to see the full report, it is on SharePoint. It is in the Office of Institutional Research, Office of Institutional Effectiveness SharePoint site, as well as previous annual reports. So everyone on campus should have access to that through SharePoint. So thank you again, Ian and Matt. And I did put our assessment email in the chat if you've got future comments or thoughts after today's presentations. So now we're going to move to Jerry, who's going to provide us an update, and some nice overview about Middle States, their emphasis on assessment, and some of our recommendations related to that.
All right, thanks, Margaret. I'm just going to share my screen here. If I can find what I'm looking for. And it's not coming up. Hold on 1 second. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So I get to talk about, it's like a peanut butter cup, two things that everybody loves, Middle States and assessment, and put them together. So what I want to talk about in this session is 3 things. I want to provide a general overview of Middle States assessment expectations. I'm going to look a bit at the Middle States assessment requirements as noted in the standards, and also discuss assessment-related recommendations from the Middle States team report. And that includes both the recommendations made by Middle States and the recommendations that we made as a committee, as college. So in general, Middle States expectations, if you look at the Middle States standards, assessment appears in every standard. So essentially, Middle States overall expectations that we're assessing everything that we do. They expect that we have regular processes for assessment and that we communicate assessment clearly across the college. Anything that we do has to have outcomes and goals that are related to the mission, tied to the strategic plan. Middle States expects us that when we make decisions, particularly major decisions, that those are all data-informed decisions, and that data is coming out of the assessments that we're doing ourselves. Middle States wants us to create a culture of assessment so that everybody is engaged in assessment at the college and sees it as important. And in fact, looking at the fact that assessment should be everyone's job and what they do here. Middlesex also wants colleges to be transparent in terms of their data related to assessment improvement. So sort of like what we're doing now, providing a feedback loop on where assessment is so that the college is invested in assessment. When we go through the recommendations, there are recommendations from the team related to creating that culture of assessment and making assessment sort of a priority for everybody at the college. So what I'm going to do is going to go through and show you the missions and standards. I'm not going to read out and I didn't type in all of the criteria from the different standards that are related to the goals, but I'll tell you what those are generally speaking, and then look at the recommendations from each of the sections. So in standard 1, which is mission and goals, again, the mission is supposed to be central to everything we do. All of our goals and assessment should be tied back to the mission in some way, shape, or form. But there are 2 criteria in standard 1 mission and goals related to assessment. One of those is related to student learning and outcomes related to student learning, and the other one is assessment of the mission itself and goals. Middlesex expects us to regularly review our mission and make sure it's still relevant and that we're still meeting it, and to review the fact that the goals that we're putting in place for all of the activities that we're doing actually relate back to the mission. So in the Middlesex report, our self-study, we made lots of recommendations for ourselves, and within their report, the Middlesex visit team basically said, we agree with all of your recommendations for yourself. They also included their own recommendations and collegial advice. I'm not going to talk about the collegial advice, but there is also within the collegial advice a number of things that relate directly to assessment. So you can see here, these are the assessments that are recommendations that we made for standard 1. One, basically that we look at all of our processes for assessment and make sure that what we're doing aligns with the mission. And a second one, that we continue assessment of staffing needs. One of the things that came out in this standard and in others was staff turnover and whether or not that allowed us to fulfill our mission and serve students. So the recommendation from ourselves was to continue to assess staffing needs. And again, Middlesex, as I said, they want to make sure that the mission is actually guiding our planning and resource allocation. So they want to see the mission tied into the budgeting process and into our planning process. And in this SLO and SOAR forms, there's a place where you can align your outcomes to outside outcomes, one of which is Middlesex. So the Middlesex standards can be found easily on the website. They're on our website in our accreditation section. And those are things that you can look to tie your outcomes in your SLO or SOAR directly to Middlesex. The second recommendation from Middlesex was, again, the general one in the criteria that we create a periodic assessment for the relevancy of our mission, just to make sure that actually the mission is relevant to what we're doing and what we want to do with our students. So standards 2 is ethics and integrity, which is actually just what it sounds like. There's only one criteria in this standard that relates directly to assessment, and that is to assess ethics and integrity as evidence in policies and practices. So what they want us to do is to make sure that our policies and practices are ethical and that we follow them strictly. And that comes out, I think, in the recommendations. So our recommendation really for ourselves was related to continuing efforts to develop resources and examine our policies around ethics and integrity. And Middlesex is essentially the same, that we need to have periodic assessment of all institutional policies and processes to make sure that we are acting in an ethical manner. So we're pretty much in alignment in terms of that standard. Standard 3 is one of the larger standards. This is about the design and delivery of the student learning experience. So this is basically how we work with students in the classroom and in curricular activities related to their studies. Standard 3 has 3 criteria that relate to assessment. A large one with multiple sub-criteria is directly on student learning. A second is on a review of third-party providers and how we assess them. And a third is on periodic program review. So within Standard 3, we actually made lots of recommendations for ourselves, and Middle States also made lots of recommendations for us related to assessment. So in our recommendations, we basically said we should assess critical student functions and make sure that we know which positions in the college are critical to student success, and identify them and have a plan to keep them out of future hiring freezes so that we know we continue to serve students. We suggested that we conduct some research into the impact of program cuts on the student experience. And we want to look at the effectiveness of the 4-year plans in terms of helping students and guiding them in their process while they're here to get through their degree. We also had a recommendation to increase the response rate for SLOAs. So that actually happened. I will say the response rate was down when we did the initial draft of the Middle States report, and then it went up by the final draft. So even though we're at 93, we'd like to get to 100. So this recommendation still works. Middle States only had a few that were related to directly to assessment. And that was, one was about third-party providers and making sure that we're adequately assessing the work that they do with our students. And the other was just the periodic review of student learning opportunities. So to continue to assess everything that we do in related to students and their learning. Standard 4 is the support of student experience. And again, this is a pretty large standard because it deals with everything that we do to support students outside of their academics. In Standard 4, there are 2 particular criteria that addressed assessment directly. One was overarching institutional review of student support services, which we do really through SOARs. And another on making sure that we assess programs that support the student experience. So recommendations for Standard 4. Our own recommendations, that this is kind of what Jeannie was talking about, how do we support struggling or underprepared students? So do some assessment to see what we need to do and then put something in place to do it. And then another recommendation that we made for ourselves was to collect better data for students on post-graduation so that we have more information on our alums and what they're doing and how our education supported them and what they're doing. And again, Middle States was a pretty general one, but it was to provide further evidence of periodic assessment of the effectiveness of student support programs and experiences. So again, make sure that we're getting all the SOAR reports completed, but also then doing other assessments of programs that might not be directly part of a SOAR. Standard 5, educational effectiveness assessment. As you can imagine, every criterion in this, there's 5 criteria and sub-criteria, they all relate to assessment. So I'm not going to tell you what they are, but they do relate to all parts of assessing academic programs and curriculum and anything that's related to curriculum. A lot of this was focused on what we do with SLOA assessment. So our recommendations included, again, this is part of making a culture of assessment including assessment as part of new student or new employee orientation. That we look to select new technological tools to support assessment, and this is where Watermark would come in. And again, the original self-study was written before we had made a decision on Watermark, although we knew we were looking at something. Looking at developing quantitative data analysis. A lot of what we have is often qualitative, and we want to make sure we had more quantitative data. We recommend it to ourselves that we complete a regular assessment of the core as a program. So we do assess all the parts of the core through SLOAS for individual areas, but we don't currently assess the program as a whole. There's a subcommittee of UAC that's now looking at doing that. And again, a recommendation to improve the feedback loop. So that's again back to the communication of assessment. Middle States said that we should provide more evidence of assessment of student achievement. We should demonstrate assessment results to improve educational effectiveness. And again, these are pretty generic. We have to show evidence of adequate and appropriate review and approval of assessment services by third-party vendors. Again, you get the third-party vendor there. And then periodic assessment of the effectiveness of assessment processes so that we can improve education. So basically, we need to do more assessment and make sure that all the assessment comes back to improve supports for students. Planning resources and institutional improvement. There's 9 criteria in the standard, 5 of them relate to assessment. There's one that relates to institutional objectives and the alignment with the mission. One that looks at documentation of planning and improvement processes. One that concerns comprehensive facilities and infrastructure planning. One on measuring the adequacy of our resources, and one on the periodic assessment of planning. So there are a bunch of things in this particular standard in terms of assessment. So our recommendations, we only really had one, and that was that we look at implementing a policy and policy review. We do have this policy. I don't know if it's been approved, but I know it's in place. But we thought overall that one of the things that we had a regular review of policies, so that would do a lot of things, not just for this standard, but for other standards like ethics and integrity. Middle States recommendations, again, further evidence of comprehensive long-range planning processes, capacity to support enrollment increases. That was looking at our enrollment projections in the strategic plan, and making sure that we had capacity to support those increases. And then again, sufficiency of financial resources, which we all know is something that the college has been looking at pretty closely for a number of years. And finally, standard 7, governance, leadership, and administration. There are 4 criteria in this standard that relate directly to assessment. 2 of those criteria are about the evaluation of the CEO, so evaluation of the president. One relates to the systematic review of administrative units, which would be SOARs, and one would be on the periodic review of governance. So our recommendations were basically that we should the faculty should establish a process to assess satisfaction with shared governance, which would include an assessment of each of the standing committees in our governance process. Middle States recommended systematic procedures for evaluating administrative units, which I think is partly that is making sure we have a better response to SOAR. So if we have 100% response to SOAR assessments, that would help to cover that. And the other one is sort of like our own recommendation, which was to provide a way of assessing the effectiveness of governance, leadership, and administration overall. So that's it. And are there any questions?
There was a question in the chat. I tried to answer it, but Margaret, Jerry, I don't know anyone else from IWG, third party
Yes.
vendors and assessment. The only two that I can come up with off the cuff was student facing tools like Navigate and Canvas.
Actually, those are not considered third part. They are the college's vendors, but with Middle States, they're particularly concerned with how they define, and the U.S. Department of Education defines third-party vendors as outside companies that are authorized to participate in student assistance programs. So it's companies that are providing instruction for our students that in turn are tied to tuition and payments for them to recruit and deliver instruction. We are in conversation with Middle States about site. That is the closest thing that we have to a third-party vendor. It does not actually technically meet their definition as a third-party vendor. There are companies out there that sell their online instructional services and actually develop courses and recruit students for online programs. And right now, that is where Middle States is focusing their third-party definition and oversight.
And just to add to that, as Margaret said, site is the closest thing we have, and site is what Middle States focused on in their report.
And the difference here is that the site students are actually accepted by us. They're not accepted by site. They are St. Rose students. It is our curriculum. We monitor that curriculum. So we do assess that program the same way we assess our on-campus educational leadership programs. Other questions, comments, thoughts about Middle States? And I know you thought when they left in March, it would go away. They don't.
Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, historically, I know we obviously have assessment already going on in the college historically, but in the sense of response rates, how have they been at a certain level historically? As far as the types of data that the surveys and the type of data collection we've been getting, whether it's college-wide or programmatically, has there been like a general percentage of response that we've been getting?
So I think it depends on what it is that you're referring to. So SLOAS, as Ian and Matt noted in their report, 93% is the highest percentage that we've ever had with SLOA reports. SOAR reports, we've only been doing those now for 3 years. And we did have a slight dip. We were at 100% for the SOAR reports, but we did have a slight dip this past year, both due to turnover and merger of some departments. When we do external surveys or surveys of our graduates, recently our post-graduation survey has had an extremely low response rate. And career services and alumni relations are working very hard on increasing that. We'd like it to be, above 40. Ideally, we'd like it to be at 100%, but we've been hovering in the 20s the past couple of years. So we're trying to increase those.
Okay, right. Okay. I was just asking because I'm thinking that if we're going to be I guess the simple question would be if we are going to put forth any type, we want to put ideas together for surveys, whether they are for our program or any others, if the timing is an issue, because there could be like a survey fatigue type thing, is that considered as far as timing of these in some way?
Yes,
Any
and-
advice on that?
So, in the past, any large survey that goes to the campus community, we've actually run that through the Office of Institutional Effectiveness, just for that reason. So, we do consider survey fatigue, timing, are there several surveys out there that are launched, and people get them confused, don't respond to them because they thought they already did. So we do try to manage that as much
Mhm.
as we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? It's nice to see so many people here. I'm going through the multiple screens to make sure we get everybody. So thank you, Jerry. Appreciate your presentation. And again, you can begin to see there's some overlap between the Middle State self-study, our annual assessment report, our strategic plan, as there should be. It provides reinforcement that we are identifying items that we should be identifying, but it also provides us an opportunity to coordinate our efforts. Are there general questions for the group before we go into breakout sessions? Lita's going to put us into an administrative staff group and a faculty group, so we can talk specifically about the SOAR and the SLOA reports and see if you have any questions. Mark?
Yeah, I just had one quick thing. And maybe this was skipped because I missed some of the earlier parts, so I apologize for that. But is there, if we're going to run either a programmatic, if we're going to develop our own assessment for an area or two, is there a template that we would work from, or do we do it the other way, where we would contact assessment, say, hey, these are the questions we're looking to do to assess a particular area, then someone look it over, or is there something like that, or do we do it natively and then
So are you talking about a survey?
yeah, survey, or assessing a particular programmatic area? Does it
That's
have to
usually-
match a certain format, or
That's usually up to the individual program or unit.
okay, thank you.
Anything else? All right, well, thank you for our speakers. Thank you for your attention thus far, and Lita's going to go ahead and put us into breakout sessions. Our event this morning will end after the breakout sessions, so we're not going to come back together as a group. But remember, if you have thoughts, comments, suggestions, please consider using the assessment at strohs.edu. And thank you all. And I'll see some of you shortly as we move into our groups.